Welcome back, deep divers. We're diving deep into ISO 1911.2018 today, specifically Clause 6.
That's right. Conducting an audit, it's called.
Like actually doing the audit step by step. We'll be your instructors today, guiding you through it, using the ISO standard itself as our textbook.
Exactly. Straight from the source, 1911.2018, laying out the framework for auditing any management system, really.
The goal, super clear understanding of each stage of a management system audit.
Yep, just as if we were in a training session, taking it one step at a time. So where do we even begin?
Let's kick things off with initiating the audit. That's 6.2 in the standard. Right away, they make it clear. The audit team leader, they're the one running the show from this point till the very end.
The conductor of the audit orchestra.
Right. But, and this is important, the standard emphasizes flexibility.
So even from the get-go, it's not just rigidly following a checklist.
Exactly. The order of these initial steps, it can change. Depends on the organization being audited, the auditee, the standard calls them.
And, of course, their specific processes, whatever's unique to that audit.
Absolutely. Adaptability is key. That's a major takeaway right off the bat.
So how about we take a look at the first concrete action, 6.2.2, establishing contact with the auditee.
Okay, so this is where the audit team leader, reaches out, sets the stage. Sounds simple enough?
It's the initial handshake. But don't be fooled, there are a lot of crucial elements involved.
So first things first, confirming communication channels. Got to be on the same page, right? Who's the point person? Best way to reach them.
Essential stuff. And you know what else is crucial? Making sure you're actually authorized to conduct the audit. Don't want to put the cart before the horse.
Imagine spending all that time prepping and then, bam, no authority. Back to square one.
Waste of everyone's time and resources.
No.
Big no-no. But thinking bigger picture here, these initial steps.
They're about respect, transparency, setting the foundation for a smooth audit.
Exactly. Everyone needs to be clear on their roles and responsibilities from the very beginning, and the standard's very specific. The audit team has to share certain information with the auditee during this initial contact.
Like a briefing, right, giving them the lay of the land. So what do we tell them? Well, the audit objectives, for starters.
What are we actually trying to achieve with this audit? Lay it out clearly.
Scope 2. What exactly are we looking at? What are the criteria we'll be using? And then, of course, who's on the team?
The players. Any specialists, technical experts, everyone involved. Full transparency.
Absolutely. And on the flip side, what does the audit team need to learn from the auditee?
That's where it gets interesting. The standard talks about requesting information for planning. We're talking risks and opportunities here.
That's right. Getting a peek into their world.
Yeah.
How are they managing those risks and opportunities? What are their biggest challenges?
It's like getting a preliminary map before you start exploring the territory.
And we can't forget the legal stuff. Statutory and regulatory requirements, all that jazz.
Understanding the external rules of the game. The playing field they're on.
Then there's confidentiality. Always a big one. The standard's very clear. You need an agreement on disclosure.
How much information will the audit team share? How will confidential stuff be handled during the audit? Trust is key.
Absolutely. Building that trust, that's part of this initial contact too.
And then come the more practical bits. Logistics, scheduling the audit, figuring out any access rules, health and safety protocols, all that good stuff.
Security procedures, data confidentiality requirements, it all needs to be ironed out. Especially if there's an on-site visit.
Don't forget observers. Do we need guides? Interpreters, maybe, if there's a language barrier? Those support roles need to be clarified up front.
All those puzzle pieces, fitting them together early on.
And another key point. Any concerns the auditee might have, risks they perceive, any specific areas of interest for this audit?
Get it all out on the table, right? Proactive communication.
Prevents surprises down the road, helps focus the audit effectively. And finally, there's the audit team itself. Any issues with its composition.
Making sure everyone has the right skills, no conflicts of interest, all that good stuff.
Impartiality and objectivity, those are non-negotiable.
Absolutely. So that's establishing contact, a lot more to it than meets the eye.
It sets the stage for everything that follows.
And it leads us to the next step, determining the feasibility of the audit, section 6.2.3. Basically, can we actually do this?
Can we pull this off given the information gathered, the resources we have? That's the question.
So when might an audit not be feasible? The standard gives us a few scenarios. 1, Not enough info.
The auditee is not providing enough documentation, can't access what we need. That's a red flag.
Yeah, can't audit what you can't see, right?
Exactly. And then there's cooperation or lack thereof.
The auditee is dragging their feet, not really engaged.
An
That's going to make things tough.
uphill battle for sure. And finally, the audit team itself. Do we have enough time? Resources? Access to the right IT systems?
Rushing a complex audit, not having the right tools, that's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And the standard's clear. If it's not feasible, the team leader needs to propose alternatives.
To the audit client, and importantly, it has to be agreed upon by the auditee.
Collaboration, even when there are roadblocks. It's about managing expectations realistically.
Okay, so let's say the audit gets the green light. We've established contact, determined it's doable. What's next?
Prep time. Clause 6.3, preparing audit activities. And we kick things off with a good old-fashioned review of documented information. That's 6.3.1.
Homework time. Before the actual audit, whether it's on-site or remote, got to do our research.
Absolutely. And this review, it serves multiple purposes. First, understanding the auditee's operations. How do they do things? What are the key processes?
Right, getting a grasp of their internal workings, and then based on that, we can prepare our own stuff.
The audit plan, checklists, interview questions, all tailored to their specific situation.
And this review also gives us a sense of how much documentation they have. Are there any potential red flags there?
Gaps, inconsistencies, things that don't quite add up. We start getting a feel for potential areas of concern.
And what kind of documents are we talking about here? Management system documents
Yeah.
and records, obviously.
Plus, reports from any previous audits. We want to see their track record. How have they been doing?
Building that comprehensive picture piece by piece.
But remember, and the standard really hammers this home, you can't review this documentation in a vacuum.
Right, got to consider the auditee's context.
Their size, what they do, how complex their operations are, their specific risks and opportunities.
All those factors influence how we approach this documentation review. A small startup versus a multinational corporation, those are two different beasts.
Exactly. And of course, we also need to align our review with the scope, the criteria, the objectives of this particular audit. We're not just randomly flipping through pages.
Okay, so documentation review check. Now we get to the heart of preparation audit planning itself.
6.3.2, a critical phase. And right away, the standard emphasizes risk-based planning.
Risk-based, that's a big theme these days.
And here, it has two main aspects. First, we have to think about the risks the audit activities themselves might pose to the auditee.
We don't want to become a risk ourselves.
Exactly. Imagine conducting an audit in a sensitive production area and accidentally contaminating something. Or disrupting operations. Not good.
Yeah, the last thing we want is to cause problems while trying to assess them.
So the audit plan, it needs to address that. How are we going to minimize any negative impacts from our presence?
Mitigate those risks.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. And what's the other side of risk-based planning?
Well, that's considering the risks of not achieving the audit objectives because of poor planning.
So if we don't plan effectively, we might miss something crucial. Not allocate resources properly, use inefficient methods.
And ultimately, we fail to get a clear picture of how well their management system is actually working. That's a big risk.
Absolutely. And the standard even gives us specific examples of risks to the auditee that the audit might impact.
Things like health and safety performance, environmental impact, product or service quality. We need to be mindful of all that.
And if it's a combined audit, multiple management systems at once.
We have to consider how those processes interact, how objectives might conflict. It's like a complex machine with interconnected gears.
You don't want those gears grinding against each other. So what exactly does a good audit plan need to include?
Okay, first off, objectives. What are we trying to find out? Clearly stated. Then, scope. What parts of the organization are we looking at? Which functions? Processes?
Defining the boundaries of the audit. And of course, we need to know the criteria, the standards we're using to evaluate them.
Exactly. Any relevant reference documents, too. Then we get into the practicalities, locations. Where are we conducting the audit? Physical sites, virtual environments.
And of course, the schedule. Dates, times, duration of all the activities, meetings with their personnel.
All those logistics hammered out in detail, both for our sake and theirs.
And what about familiarization? Do we need a site tour? Do we need to get up to speed on their IT systems?
Some audits require a bit of a warm-up. Get the lay of the land before we dive in.
Right. And then there are the methods. How are we actually gathering evidence? Interviews, observations, document review.
Sampling, too. To what extent are we going to rely on sampling to draw conclusions?
And then, of course, roles and responsibilities. Who's doing what?
Every member of the audit team, any guides they provide, observers, interpreters, everyone needs a clearly defined role.
And we can't forget about resource allocation. Are we assigning the right people with the right skills to the right tasks?
And are we dedicating enough resources to areas with higher risks or significant opportunities? That risk-based approach should guide us here.
It's all about being strategic. And the standard doesn't stop there. It even suggests considering other things.
Like who their main representative will be, our point person, the working and reporting language if it's different, the topics covered in the audit report, logistics, communication, all that good stuff.
And then there are the proactive bits. How are we going to address risks to achieving the objectives?
Any opportunities we see to gather extra valuable information along the way.
Thinking ahead. And of course, confidentiality. That's always a big one. Information security, too. Those need to be explicitly addressed in the plan.
Protecting their sensitive information, that's paramount. And we also need to consider follow-up actions.
From previous audits, lessons learned, outcomes of management reviews.
All that feeds into our plan. And looking ahead, what kind of follow-up might be needed after this audit?
And if there are other audits happening concurrently, especially joint audits.
That coordination piece is crucial. So we've got this beautiful, comprehensive plan. What happens next?
Well, you can't just spring it on the auditee. The standard's very clear presented to them.
Give them a chance to review it, ask questions, raise any concerns they might have before we actually kick things off.
It's a collaboration. And any issues that come up, they need to be resolved. Between the team leader, the auditee, maybe the folks managing the audit program, everyone needs to be on board with the plan. That's essential for a successful audit.
Absolutely. Agreement up front. That sets the tone for the entire process. Okay, so we've initiated the audit, determined it's feasible, we've planned everything meticulously. What's next?
Time to delegate. 6.3.3, assigning work to the audit team. Each member gets their marching orders.
The audit team leader, they're the ones calling the shots here, deciding who focuses on what.
And the standard stresses the importance of clearly defining those responsibilities. Specific processes, activities, functions, locations.
Giving each auditor their area of expertise. And in some cases, they might even have decision-making authority within their assigned area.
So what factors does the team leader need to consider when making those assignments? Impartiality and objectivity, obviously, top of the list.
Absolutely. We need to maintain the integrity of the audit. Every member needs to have the right competence and expertise for their assigned areas. You wouldn't send a financial auditor to evaluate an environmental management system, would you?
No way. It's about matching skills to tasks. And of course, we want to make the most efficient use of our resources.
Right. The right people, right skills, right tasks. Spreading the workload effectively.
And the team leader has to consider the different roles within the team. Lead auditors, technical specialists, trainees who are still learning the ropes, maybe even external experts.
Leveraging everyone's strengths. And you know what else can be really helpful at this stage?
Team meetings.
Bingo! 19011 explicitly mentions them.
So what's the purpose of those team meetings?
Well, first off, communicating those assignments, making sure everyone knows what they're responsible for, discussing the overall strategy, making sure we're all on the same page.
And then as the audit progresses, those meetings become even more important.
Things change, new information comes to light, unexpected situations pop up. We might need to adjust those assignments on the fly.
So those meetings help us stay agile, adapt to the evolving situation.
Exactly. Keeping that flexibility, that's crucial for a successful audit. Okay, so now everyone knows their role, their area of focus. The last prep step before we actually get into the audit itself.
6.3.4, preparing the documented information for the audit. Basically, getting our ducks in a row.
This is where individual auditors really roll up their sleeves. They've reviewed the information, they know their responsibilities, now they start creating their own working documents.
The tools of the trade.
Checklists, physical or digital, whatever works best. Plans for sampling, forms for recording their observations, their findings, any notes on audiovisual stuff they need to capture.
It's like each instructor prepping their lesson plan, their materials, before they go into the classroom.
A great analogy, but, and this is a big caveat, the standard is clear. These working documents, they're not meant to be straitjackets.
We're not robots blindly following a script.
Exactly. They provide structure, guidance, but we need to remain flexible. If the evidence leads us in a different direction, we need to be able to adapt.
That checklist, it's a roadmap, not a prison.
Perfectly put. The audit needs to be a dynamic process. So all this information we're gathering, all these documents, how long do we keep them around?
Good question.
The standard says at least until the audit is done, or longer if the program requires it, or if there are any legal requirements. And of course, confidentiality, that's a constant theme.
Protecting that sensitive information, even after the audit's done.
Absolutely. Okay, we've prepped, we've planned, we've signed tasks, we've got our tools ready.
It's showtime. 6.4, conducting audit activities.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
6.4.1 gives us a general overview. It points us to Figure 1, which shows the sequence of activities.
The standard lays it out nicely, but again, flexibility is key. We can adjust the flow as needed.
So the first order of business, 6.4.2, is about those guides and observers. We mentioned them briefly earlier, but let's unpack that a bit.
They can be helpful, but there are definitely some ground rules. First off, their presence requires approval.
From the team leader, the client, maybe even the auditee.
Multiple layers of approval, making sure they won't hinder the process. And the golden rule, no interference.
They're there to observe, assist, not to influence the audit.
If the team leader feels their presence compromises the audit's objectivity, they can say no.
They have that authority. So let's talk about guides specifically. Who are they? What do they do?
They're folks appointed by the auditee, basically our local helpers.
Helping us navigate their organization.
Exactly. Arranging interviews, making sure we can access different areas, physical or virtual.
And making sure we follow all their internal rules, right? Health and safety, security protocols, all that.
They're like our on-site chaperones. And they can act as witnesses for the auditee during certain activities.
And maybe provide some clarifications, help us gather information.
So guides and observers sorted, what's the next big milestone?
The opening meeting. 6.4.3. It's official. The audit is underway.
The kickoff.
What are we trying to achieve with this meeting?
3 main things. Confirming everyone's on board with the scope, the objectives, the plan. Introducing the team, our roles, who's doing what, and making sure we can actually carry out all those planned activities. No surprises.
So who attends this momentous gathering?
The auditee's management team, the folks responsible for the areas we're auditing. The client might be there too. And it's a chance for them to ask any questions they might have.
Getting those clarifications up front.
Exactly. And the level of formality, that can vary. An internal audit, small organization, it might be pretty casual, just a quick chat.
But external audits, bigger organizations, things get more formal. Maybe even minutes and attendance records.
Whatever the format, the team leader runs the show.
And what do they actually talk about during this opening meeting?
Well, introductions, obviously. Any observers, guides, interpreters. We introduce them, explain their roles, and we might give a quick overview of our methods, especially if it impacts them in any way.
Like how we're managing risks associated with our presence?
Exactly. And then, of course, reconfirming the key stuff. Objectives, scope, criteria, the audit plan, the logistics, when's the closing meeting, any interim meetings planned.
Making sure everyone's on the same page, no misunderstandings.
Exactly. And we'll talk about communication. How are we going to keep them in the loop about our progress? Any significant findings we come across?
Keep the lines of communication open.
And the practical stuff, of course. Resources, facilities we need, confidentiality, security, access procedures, health and safety, emergency arrangements.
All those nuts and bolts need to be tightened.
And if there's anything happening on their side, that might affect the audit.
Any ongoing activities, anything that could throw a wrench in the works, we need to know that up front.
So it's a comprehensive start to the audit activities.
And the opening meeting also sets the stage for how we handle those findings, right? How we communicate them later on.
Absolutely. The team leader will explain how we document and report those findings, any grading criteria, if that's relevant.
Minor nonconformities, major nonconformities, all that.
And we'll clarify the conditions under which the audit might need to be adjusted or even terminated.
If something unexpected comes up.
And how we address those findings, how we communicate them to the auditee during the audit. Do they have a formal feedback system? Can they complain, appeal?
It's about setting clear expectations, being transparent.
Building that trust. Okay, opening meeting done. We're in the thick of it now.
6.4.4. Communicating during the audit. Sounds pretty self-explanatory, but the standard dives into some detail here.
Communication's key throughout the entire process, and the standard stresses the importance of having formal arrangements.
Not just casual chats in the hallway.
Precisely. We need clear channels for information exchange, within the team itself, with the auditee, with the client, maybe even external parties, like regulators.
So what does that look like in practice?
Regular team meetings, that's a big one. Sharing information, assessing progress, maybe adjusting who's doing what. And the team leader, they're the main point of contact.
They keep the auditee and the client updated on how things are going. Any significant findings, any major concerns,
And if something comes up that poses an immediate risk,
a serious safety hazard, someone like that.
that gets reported right away. No waiting for the final report. Action needs to be taken, and fast.
And if a team member finds something outside the scope of the audit,
They still document it, report it to the team leader. It might be relevant even if it's not directly within our purview.
and what if, as we're going along, it becomes clear we can't achieve those initial objectives? Maybe not enough information, maybe the auditee's not cooperating.
The team leader has to report that, both to the client and the auditee. Then we figure out what to do. Maybe adjust the plan, maybe narrow the scope, maybe even terminate the audit.
And any changes to the plan.
They need to be reviewed and approved by the folks managing the audit program, the client too. And of course, the auditee needs to be informed. Transparency all the way.
Communication. It's the glue that holds the whole thing together.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about something equally crucial. 6.4.5, audit information availability and access. Basically, how do we get the info we need?
Access is everything.
And the standard makes it clear our methods, how we gather information. It depends on a few factors.
Objectives, scope, criteria, the duration of the audit, and
Location, location, location.
not just where the office is, right?
Right. Location in the broader sense. Physical places, offices, production lines, but also virtual environments, databases, systems, wherever that information lives.
So we need to know where the information is, when we can access it, and how we can access it,
Right.
whether it's a paper file or a cloud-based system.
Exactly. And based on that, we choose the right methods. Interviews, observations, document review, a combination of all those. And we might need to adapt those methods as we go along. The situation might require us to change our approach.
Flexibility is key, again.
Absolutely. Okay, so we know how to access the information. Now, 6.4.6 takes us to the ongoing review of documented information. We talked about the initial review during prep, but this is different.
This is happening while we're actually doing the audit, right?
Exactly. It's an ongoing process happening alongside those interviews, those observations. And it has two main purposes. One, checking if their documented system actually matches the criteria. Does it conform? And two, using that documentation to get a deeper understanding of the processes we're auditing.
So we're constantly checking the theory against the reality, using the documentation as our guide.
A continuous loop. But as always, there's a what if. What if they can't provide the documentation we need when we need it?
That happens sometimes.
The team leader needs to inform both the folks managing the program and the auditee's management. And then we decide, do we push on or do we hit pause until we have what we need?
Can't evaluate something if you don't have all the pieces.
Exactly. So access sorted, documentation reviewed, now we get to the heart of the matter. 6.4.7, collecting and verifying information. This is where the real detective work begins.
It's time to gather those clues.
We're collecting evidence that's relevant to our objectives, the scope, the criteria. And the standard emphasizes looking at those interfaces between different functions, activities, processes. How does it all connect?
Seeing the big picture.
Right. And this information, we collect it using sampling techniques. And here's a crucial point: verification. We can't just take everything at face value.
You need proof.
As much as is practicable, we have to make sure the information is accurate, reliable, and the standards clear only verifiable information can be used as audit evidence.
Solid evidence leads to solid findings.
Exactly. But the standard acknowledges that sometimes perfect verification is impossible. In those cases, the auditor has to use their judgment. How much can they rely on this less verifiable information? It's a balancing act.
And any information we accept as evidence, especially if it leads to a finding, it needs to be documented carefully.
Traceability is key. And what if we find something new? New circumstances, new risks, new opportunities.
We adapt, right?
Yeah, we have to. The audit's a living thing, always evolving. And Figure 2 in the standard, it provides a helpful overview of this whole collection and verification process.
It also mentions those common methods: interviews, observations, document review, the classics.
The tried and true techniques. So information gathered, verified, what's next?
Time to make sense of it all. 6.4.8, generating audit findings. We're evaluating that evidence against the criteria.
Judgment time.
And the outcome, the audit findings. conformity where they meet the criteria or nonconformity where they don't.
And depending on the audit's objectives, we might also document instances of good practice, opportunities for improvement.
Highlighting what they're doing well, suggesting ways to do even better.
And if we find a nonconformity, that needs to be clearly recorded with all the evidence to back it up. And sometimes those nonconformities, they get graded.
How serious are they?
Exactly. Quantitative, maybe a numerical score, or qualitative, like minor, major. And here's the crucial part. We review those nonconformities with the auditee.
Making sure they understand what we found, why we found it.
Open communication, trying to resolve any disagreements, and if we can't agree, we document that too. It all goes in the report.
And throughout this process, the team itself should be meeting regularly.
Sharing findings, ensuring consistency, making sure we're all on the same page. Okay, findings generated, evidence evaluated, discussions had.
Time for 6.4.9, determining audit conclusions. This is where we start wrapping things up, getting ready for the closing meeting.
The home stretch. 6.4.9.1 talks about preparing for that closing meeting. The team gets together, reviews all the findings, all the information gathered. We compare it to those initial objectives.
Did we achieve what we set out to do?
Exactly. And we agree on the overall conclusions, but remember, there's always a degree of uncertainty in an audit. We're relying on samples, not a complete picture.
So we acknowledge that limitation.
And if we're tasked with making recommendations, we prepare those too, plus any potential follow-up activities.
Thinking ahead. And what about those conclusions? What should they address?
6.4.9.2 lays it out nicely. First, conformity. To what extent does their system meet the criteria? How robust is it? How effective is it at achieving its goals?
And their risk management. How well are they handling those risks and opportunities?
A key part of any management system. And then implementation, maintenance, continuous improvement. How well are they doing on all those fronts?
And did we achieve those initial objectives? Did we cover the entire scope? Did we address all the criteria?
All those boxes need to be checked. And we look for trends. Are there similar findings popping up in different areas? Are we seeing the same issues from previous audits?
Those patterns can tell us a lot. And if recommendations were part of the deal, we present them. But they're just that, recommendations.
Not mandatory requirements. Okay, evidence gathered, findings made, conclusions drawn, time for the grand finale.
6.4.10, the closing meeting. We deliver the verdict.
We present our findings, our conclusions to the auditee's management and anyone else who's relevant.
The client, the team, maybe some other interested parties. The team leaders in charge, they run the show.
And they have to point out anything that might affect the reliability of our conclusions. Any limitations we encountered, any issues that might make our findings less certain.
Transparency is paramount.
And if it's required by the standard or by the client, we'll discuss a time frame for them to address those findings.
Develop an action plan, get things back on track.
And the level of detail we go into, that depends. How effective is their system? How well are they managing their risks? How familiar are they with the audit process?
Tailoring the message to the audience.
And just like the opening meeting, the level of formality can vary. External audits, certification bodies, those tend to be more formal. Minutes, attendance records, all that.
Internal audits may be a bit more relaxed.
But regardless, the team leader, they need to cover some key points. Remind them that we use sampling, so it's not a complete picture. Explain how we report our findings, the process for addressing them. What happens if they don't address those nonconformities?
Consequences.
And those findings, those conclusions, they need to be presented clearly. We want them to understand, acknowledge what we found, and any post-audit activities, corrective actions, complaints, appeals, all that gets mentioned too.
So it's a wrap-up, but it's also a starting point for their next steps.
Exactly. And what if we still disagree on something, a finding, a conclusion?
Happens sometimes.
We talk it through, try to reach a resolution, but if we can't agree, that gets documented in the report. Transparency, always. And those recommendations for improvement, if we made any, we emphasize that they're not mandatory.
Just suggestions, food for thought.
Exactly. Okay. Audit activities done, closing meeting done. What's left?
The paperwork. 6.5. Preparing and distributing the audit report, making it official.
The team leader, they're the author here. They write the report based on everything we've done, all the conclusions we've reached. And the standard, it's very specific about what that report needs to include.
The essentials.
Objectives, scope, who the client is, who participated, dates, locations, the criteria we used, all the findings, the evidence, the conclusions.
A complete record.
And a few other key statements. How well did they meet the criteria? Were there any unresolved disagreements? A reminder that we used sampling.
Covering all the bases. And what about optional stuff?
There's a whole list.